last Sunday in my lesson, I encouraged, I challenged you. In fact, God encouraged and challenged us to guard our hearts. That we learned that our hearts are so precious, that they have so much control over our lives, that we need to guard them. And the writer of Proverbs tells us that because everything in our life flows out of our heart. And so as a result, we need to be careful what we allow into our hearts. And very simplistic message, because the points of the lesson were from a childhood Bible song. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little mouth, what you say. Oh, be careful, little ears, what you hear. Oh, be careful, little feet, where you go. Because those are the things that we're allowing into our heart. They're coming through those ways in our life. And I hope that you've spent this week focusing on those ways that we can guard our heart. That you've been put a little more thought in. What am I listening to? What am I watching? What am I speaking? Where am I going? And as a result, that maybe you have guarded your heart a little bit better this week, and that with God's help, that you are a little bit more like Jesus as a result. But I do want to recognize that there's one area that it is very difficult to guard against with our heart. And the problem is because the problem starts in us. And so the problem is how can I guard myself from what's already in me? And so that's what we're going to talk about this morning. And I hope that you can see within yourself the challenge. And as a result, have a desire to find the cure of what that problem is in our heart, in each of our heart. Because I believe that it's true that the problem is in each of us. It's not just in me. It's not just in you. It's not just in your neighbor. It's not in the other people in the world. This is a problem in each of us. It says in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16, everything that belongs to the world, what the sinful self desires, what people see and want, and everything in this world that people are so proud of, none of this comes from the Father. It all comes from the world. None of these things, sinful self-desires, what we see and what we want, and everything in this world that people are so proud of, these all come from the world. And notice what it started with. What the sinful self desires. I don't know, do you have any struggle with what your sinful self desires? The Bible says, as a whole, the world has that problem. And so I don't know if you're struggling with that in your life. I continue to struggle with that. I've been a follower of Jesus for most of my life, and I still struggle with myself. I struggle with that selfishness. And so this is prevalent in the world. You don't have to look very far to see the selfishness in people. We just remembered 9/11 yesterday. What was the origin of that? Self. A number of people that thought their way of life, that their ideology was more important than the lives of all these people. And so to strike terror into this country and into the ideology that we live by, and even attack on our religion, in the belief in Jesus Christ and in God, they acted out of selfishness. And as a result, look at the tragedy. Look at how much hurt was caused. And that's a big thing. Now take that down to every day, every one of us, the things that we do because we're thinking about ourselves instead of someone else. We're thinking about what I want instead of what someone else may want or need. And so that selfishness is such a terrible thing, because that's the origin, as like we were just reading, that's from the world, and that's what results in sin. In fact, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, Paul, writing to a young preacher by the name of Timothy, paints this very dark picture of the world in our time, in these last days, which began after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which will end when Jesus returns again. So we are in these last days. And listen to what Paul says about these last days. He says, "But know this, difficult times will come in the last days. For people will be lovers of self." Number one, that's where you start. If you want to see how terrible things have become in these last days, he starts with people will be lovers of self. And when you have a world filled with people who are lovers of self, you have a world that's filled with sin, a world that's filled with evil, a world that's filled with hurt, a world that is on the verge of destruction, because everyone's loving themselves. He goes on and he says lovers of money, which goes right along with that. Boastful. Why do we boast? Because we love ourselves and we want to talk about ourselves and what we have and what we've done and what we've got. And he goes on, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, slanderers, without self-control. There it is again, without self-control. See, because I'm a lover of myself and I want what my self wants, I want what I want, I don't need to control myself. I don't need to control. And so we become people without control, which leads to the next. It says brutal, without love for what is good. Why? Because we're so busy loving ourselves and loving what we want that we are without love for what is good. Traitors, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Oh, we've got a world filled with love, but look at what it's been. It's love for self, love for pleasure, and not love for what's good and love for God. That's a sad picture. That's a sad picture of the world we live in, but it is so true. Again, this isn't a blanket statement. I know there are good people out there. I know there are selfless people out there. I know there are people that are giving so much. But even, listen to this, we can be lovers of self and we can be selfish even when we're doing something good for someone else. Because maybe the reason we're doing it is we want the praise. We want the blessings that come from that. We want the return. The question is, would you still do the good? Would you still be selfless if you got nothing in return? And that's a question each one of us need to ask ourselves. I need to ask myself, would I be a preacher if I didn't get the rewards for what that means? Whether it's my income, whether it's the feelings that come from being someone that's doing God's will. All of those things, if I'm doing it for the wrong reason, if I'm not doing it because I love good and I love God, I have to be careful. And that's where the selfishness is so insidious. It's so tricky. It can convince us we're doing it for the right reason when we're just doing it for ourselves. And that's why sin is such a big part of our lives, because when it comes down to it, in the end, if we're doing it for self, God is not going to stand for that. And so he's going to put something in our path where we have to choose. Are we going to do this because we're doing it for God, or are we going to do it for ourselves? And we won't be able to do both. We can convince ourselves for a while that I'm doing this because I want to please God, when we're really doing it for ourselves. But at some point, God is going to make us choose. Are we doing this for ourselves, or are you doing this for me? And when we do come to that point, what will we choose? And if we choose what the self wants, if that's been the motivation, remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember about people praying? It says they stand on the corner and pray so they could be heard, and people can say, oh, they're such wonderful. Look at how religious they are. Look at how much they love God. And he says the people that do that, he says they've already received the reward. And he says it's the same about the person who's giving. He says if you're going to give, don't let he goes through the ridiculousness of pointing out the idea of this hyperbole. Don't even let your right hand know what your left hand is doing when you give. In other words, do it in secret. You don't need, because what they would do, he says there were those that would stand on a corner and someone would blow the horn and say, I'm giving all of this to help somebody. Again, why were they doing it? For self. We have to be so careful that we are not caught in this trap of selfishness. In fact, in James 1, this makes it a little bit more personal. James 1, because we've been talking about the world and the last days. Let's talk about us. James 1, 14 and 15. Remember we talked about James. James is the half-brother of Jesus, son of Mary and Joseph. And James, who wrote this book of James, later became an elder in the church in Jerusalem, a believer, a follower of his half-brother Jesus Christ. But I believe as he writes this, he's not just writing from inspiration. He is writing from the experience of having grown up in the same house as Jesus Christ our Lord. And so the things that he's telling us are the things that he saw and learned by his relationship with his brother. And listen to what he says about temptation, about desires, about the self. He says temptations come from our own desires. There it is, our self, our own desires, which entice us. Our own desires coming from the inside. Something I can't guard from because it's already in me. Temptation comes from our own desire, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions. See the progression? They start out as a desire that entices us. And then that conceives and gives birth to sinful actions. And when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. What is that telling us? We better watch out. Because if we let selfishness rule our lives, if we let selfishness be the greater part of us, if our motivation for what we do is because of ourself, if that is the extent of our world, is we see ourself as the center of the world, the center of the universe, and everything is revolving around us. He says, watch out, because he says those desires that are in us that are evil, that's going to result in sin. And the sin gives birth, or will result in death. And that's talking about spiritual death, separation from God. So, here's the point. The world and I am filled with selfishness. That's the reality. The world and each of us have this battle going on within us of selfishness. It's like a disease. It's like we talk about and we worry and we're so fearful of COVID. There is something so much worse, and that is selfishness that results in sin. Selfishness is the virus that results in sin. And guess what? You already have it in you. That's scary. And so, what is the cure? for selfishness. Because remember, this is a life and death situation. It says that selfishness, those evil desires in us, result in sin and bring about spiritual death. I mean, we're not just talking about physical death. We're not just talking about dying and then going to heaven. We're talking about dying spiritually, being separated eternally from God. I don't want that, and I don't want that for anyone. And God, listen, God doesn't want that for anyone. And so we need a cure for the selfishness that's within us. So what's the cure? Look at Ephesians 4 and verse 22. Ephesians 4:22, Paul tells us, so get rid of your old self, which made you live as you used to. The old self that was being destroyed by its deceitful desires. Those deceitful desires that we just talked about, those evil desires that result in sin and lead to death. He says the answer is get rid of your old self. Because that old self is what made us live that sinful way. That old self is what's being destroyed by those evil desires, those deceitful desires that the self wants. In Galatians 2 and verse 20, this is one, because he's just told us we need to get rid of that old self. Galatians 2 and verse 20 gives us a beautiful imagery about our relationship with Jesus. Because remember, Jesus came to die for you. Jesus came to die for me. Jesus came and was hung on a cross by God's plan, God's will. Jesus willingly went to a cross and gave up his life to wash away our sins, to take away that selfish part of us. But how does that help me? That Jesus died. Listen to what it says. By our relationship with Jesus Christ, by being in Jesus, by being a part of him, by being his follower, a Christian, a disciple, what it means. He says, this is what Paul says about his relationship. And Paul was very clear about his former life. He tried to do what was right, but he talked about how he fell short, how his sinful desires misled him, how his ignorance made him miss the truth of Jesus Christ. But when he came to know Jesus, listen to what he said. In Galatians 2 and 20, he says, my old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Did you hear that? I'm no longer living. Why? Because I got rid of that sinful self. He died. He was crucified with Christ. And Christ is now living in me. So Paul says, so I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So, what is the cure for my selfishness? Paul tells us we need to get rid of that old self, and he tells us how that happens. He says the way that happens is I'm crucified with Christ, and then I no longer live. Christ lives in me. And what about that amazing life that takes place? Because I don't no longer have to be ruled by my selfishness. I'm no longer under the power of those evil desires that are so prevalent, that are so powerful, that are so much a part of this world. Remember, they come from this world. They're not from the Father. He says, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ's living in me. And so I live in this body, trusting in Jesus, the one who loves me and gave himself for me. So what's the point? What's the cure for selfishness? The self must be put to death. So how do I do that? That's a good question. And we'll talk about that next week. How do I put myself to death? But we saw the one answer. It starts in Jesus Christ. It starts by being crucified with him, and as a result, allowing him to live in us. So that's where we've got to start, in Jesus. I hope that you are in Jesus, and more importantly, that Jesus is in you. If you're not sure, if you don't know what that means, then please contact me. I would love to sit down. I'd love to talk to you about that. If you have any questions about what it means to die to self, and please be here next week as we talk about how we do that. However, wherever you are in your life right now, selfishness will destroy your life, and the cure is dying to self, putting to death the self. And that can only be done in Jesus. So turn to him. God bless and have a wonderful week.